Moment of silence for the champions, for those who make going hard a lifestyle. Never wait for nothing, gotta get it right now. I'm in the spotlight when they turn the lights down.
The involvement of various social and ethnic groups in the war is an example of the advances the country made in accepting different types of people. Men and women from all socioeconomic classes were encouraged to defend their country and were readily accepted as part of the war effort. Nevertheless, no matter how inclusive the Army may have been, segregation carried over into the line.
African Americans were separated from white Americans and given low status jobs, such as waiters and cooks, while Native Americans, Mexicans, were never segregated. Women were also enlisted, but assumed only the roles that were close to the ones they had in their normal lives, such as working in clerical work and healthcare. Due to the large number of people joining the force, a labor shortage occurred in the early 1940s. However, women and people of color quickly moved to fill the vacant positions. The government and society, in turn, encouraged the idea of women becoming workers. African Americans, eager to join the working force, did have trouble obtaining jobs due to their ethnicity. Black labor activism rose quickly, and discontent mounted until there was the possibility of a march on Washington. FDR wanted to avoid this at all costs. However, he immediately issued Executive Order 8802, which inhibited the discrimination of the employment of workers. He also created the Fair Employment Practice Commission to enforce the law, but that basically failed. Along with blacks, Mexicans were also having labor struggles. Women ultimately constituted 36% of the labor force. Problems were known to arise, though, as cases of harassment were frequent and women were paid lower wages than men. Even though working women were largely embraced during the war, when the soldiers and husbands returned home, women were expected to return to their roles as housewives.
The image of Rosie the Riveter, a depiction of a strong working woman, became popular during the time. A song was even released about the picture saying, "All the day long, whether rain or shine, she is part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory, Rosie the Riveter." Native Americans actually played an extremely important role in the United States' success in the war. Soldiers called the Navajo code talkers were able to communicate to sweet commanders without the Japanese being able to understand through a code based on the Navajo language.
Many families actually migrated during the war to towns of debarkation and base camps with their male head. Other people migrated to places with high-paying defense jobs. California was particularly a popular state. Actually, 1/10 of the federal money was funneled into California alone. With the grand migration came grand conflict, particularly between whites and blacks competing for jobs. Many African Americans moved from the South to pursue better working opportunities and living conditions. The worst conflict was particularly in Detroit, where violence broke out and a few people died. Battling the same conflicts in the West, Mexicans and whites struggled to exist together in California. The Braquera program, started in 1942, served as to encourage Mexicans to enter the country to temporarily fill low-wage agricultural jobs. Tensions between Mexicans and whites continued to grow, especially since many Americans were against the idea of having many Mexicans entering the country. To widen the ever-growing gap, many Mexicans formed youth gangs in which they dressed in zoot suits. Whites took their way of dressing as a sign of delinquency.
As Mexicans were entering California, the Japanese, mostly native-born American citizens, were being forcefully removed from their homes and put into relocation camps for the duration of the war. The Executive Order 9066 authorized the removal of the Japanese by the War Relocation Authority. Only the Japanese in Hawaii were not imprisoned because their labor was needed.
World War II, despite being the bloodiest and most intense war to have happened, proved to be an era of new opportunity and new freedom, to have more involvement in society for women and blacks in America. However, other ethnic groups, such as the Mexicans and Japanese, suffered many of the consequences. By supplying jobs to the vast majority of America, the war shrunk the enormous employment rate from 15% at the start of the war to 2% at the end of the war, effectively rebounding from the great losses caused by the Great Depression, and setting up America for a successful future, growing to become the world's #1 economic powerhouse.
Union activity was still strong, however, many unions established a no-strike policy for the duration of the war. In reward, Roosevelt created the National War Labor Board, which established wages, working hours, and working conditions. Despite this, many Americans were still not content because they thought a majority of the profit was going to the companies and not enough was going to them. Due to this, consumer prices shot up and workers started to strike, asking for higher wages. In response, the Smith-Connolly Act was created in order to prevent strikes in defense industries and forbade political contributions by unions.
A way of preserving the economy was the Office of Price Administration. They regulated the distribution of goods to citizens so to prevent shortage of items such as food, clothing, and shoes, for the purpose of avoiding profiteering and unwarranted price rises, and of facilitating an adequate supply and the equitable distribution of materials and commodities for civilian use, and finding that the stabilization of prices is in the interest of national defense.
Yep. During the war, America's people lost freedom due to imperial presidency, the idea that the president had passed the constitutional limits pertaining to his power to issue executive orders and make decisions. Taxes were raised and the government body increased 4 times. The government took contracts with big companies, ignoring the antitrust acts put forward in order to efficiently create military equipment. The War Production Board also persuaded large-scale industrial companies to switch to military production. GM stopped making cars and started making tanks. However, because of the military-industrial complex that the U.S. had become, union striking was seen as unpatriotic as it impeded the war effort, and thus were looked down upon. Because of this, the working class lost many of their rights during the war. FDR also called for the Second Bill of Rights, which grants access for all Americans to education, jobs, adequate nourishment, clothing, shelter, and medical care. He also established the government issue offering various benefits for war veterans. Outside of filling the labor force in their everyday lives, citizens aimed to aid wartime efforts. They recycled old newspapers and scrap material and also created backyard victory gardens, the fruit from which were used to feed soldiers. The Office of War Information promoted patriotism by encouraging involvement in the war. The media and movies actively displayed images and acts of aid during the war.
All the day long, whether rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage.